Emma Smith was a respected member of her community.
She was like the perfect pastor's wife.
And her husband was a popular preacher.
Everybody loved Ernest. Never heard of anybody saying that they disliked him.
Which made the circumstances around his death that much more tragic.
She heard Ernest call and say, "Baby, I've been shot."
The case went cold, lost in a deluge of crime that flooded New Orleans in the wake of Hurricane Katrina.
Given what the police department was going through at the time, this goes by the wayside.
But then Emma remarried.
He was a handsome guy, and he was fun.
And less than 6 years later, he was dead.
James Raine had been murdered.
Was it a tragic coincidence?
They have really no suspects.
Or would one family's quest for justice
We letting the murderer walk the streets.
expose the awful truth about Emma?
That's when the bombshell was dropped on us.
New Orleans, Louisiana, April 12, 2006. It was a steamy spring night in this normally laid-back river city known around the world as the Big Easy.
It's a city that definitely knows how to enjoy itself. We love parades, we love Mardi Gras.
But that April, living in New Orleans was anything but easy. 8 months after Hurricane Katrina, the city still struggled to rebuild after the catastrophe. Its population hovering at around 200,000, barely 50% of what it was before the storm blew through.
I'm not even sure you could say we were recovering at that point.
And that night, the city's population was about to get even smaller.
Sometime before midnight, the call comes into 911.
The caller was 41-year-old Emma Smith.
She stated her husband had just been killed and that she needed the police.
When police arrived minutes later, they were greeted by a gruesome scene. 38-year-old Ernest Smith lay dead just inside the couple's townhouse.
His shirt was saturated with blood. He was shot twice in his chest.
Emma told the police her husband had been out that night with a friend and that she'd been upstairs in bed when the shooting occurred.
She wasn't feeling very well. She had taken a sleeping pill, and then she heard a couple of popping sounds.
She heard the sounds outside, and she just thought it was a car that had backfired.
And according to Emma, it was only moments later that she realized what really happened.
Mr. Smith somehow managed to get himself into the house and said, "Baby, I've been shot."
Was Emma's husband simply another casualty of a city in chaos, with local government and law enforcement left so crippled by the storm's damage that it had almost descended into anarchy?
The city was struggling to fight crime in the wake of Hurricane Katrina.
Or would it take years and another murder to reveal the whole story?
It's almost titillating. There's a fascination with, how can somebody do this?
Born in 1964 in the sleepy river town of Vicksburg, Mississippi, Emma started life in modest circumstances, but grew up dreaming of bigger, better things.
She always wanted to be rich. She always wanted to live a lavish lifestyle. She always wanted to drive fancy cars.
And once Emma finished high school, she set out to make those dreams a reality.
During her time in Vicksburg, she was a tax preparer.
Emma also married and had 2 kids, a son and a daughter. But in 1993, when Emma was 29, disaster struck.
Emma's first husband, he was hit by a car, which left him as a paraplegic.
Emma spent the next year nursing her paralyzed husband, who tragically passed away in 1994.
He ended up choking to death on his feeding tube in bed one night.
A widow and a single mom at the age of 29, Emma decided to put some distance between her 11 and 12-year-old children and the memories of their father's tragic death. Soon after her husband's funeral, she moved the family to New Orleans, where she met a charismatic young minister named Ernest Smith. 4 years younger than Emma, Ernest had a hard childhood growing up in the Big Easy.
His mother and father did die, and he was around 10, and he was adopted.
He never talked about his past, never talked about his parents.
But other than a reluctance to talk, his tragic childhood left few emotional scars.
He was always like a little boy, always happy, I've never seen him where he was sad, never had a ugly look or anything on his face. I never seen him sour. I never seen him angry.
After high school, Ernest did a stint in the National Guard, got married, and had a daughter. But when the marriage ended in divorce, Ernest sought solace in religion and found his true calling.
He loved teaching the gospel and he loved preaching the gospel.
He just loved what he did. He was dedicated to the gospel.
He worked Monday through Friday as a truck driver, but shortly before he met Emma, the passionate preacher managed to start his own church. And every Sunday, people flocked to hear him preach.
He was always excited about something. When you first meet him, you fall in love with him.
That was apparently true in Emma's case. Soon after attending a service one Sunday, the single mom and the single pastor were dating.
She was very captivating. We all were.
And in 1995, she and Ernest were married.
She was like the perfect pastor's wife. She was a good host. If you came to her home, you was treated like royalty.
Being a pastor's wife is a very hard job anyway, and she was doing a very good job as far as being First Lady.
Although, like Ernest, even the First Lady had to work outside the church in order to make ends meet.
She had all these different ideas and jobs that she was doing. She owned a wig shop. She was into real estate, and she was a tax preparer.
And together, the couple raised Emma's 2 children, who Ernest treated as his own.
He was a real father to them. I know they loved him, and he did everything that a father would do.
He would often throw barbecues, and they had a pool at the house, and everybody would come over and enjoy themselves.
From what I can see from their family relationship, it was pretty good. Everything was just great between them both. To me, it was a perfect, loving family.
But in 2005, Emma's perfect life was once again swept up by tragedy, one that would affect the entire community. At the end of August, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans.
I remember one of the elected officials, as he surveyed sort of the city and looked out over the community, he said, "New Orleans as we know it will never exist again."
The storm forced the evacuation of more than half of the city's residents, including Emma, Ernest, and the kids.
During Katrina, they were displaced, and they went to Arlington, Texas.
In Texas, Ernest got a temporary truck driving job, and Emma's children, both in their early 20s, found work and settled in too. But Emma didn't stay in Houston long. Instead, she returned to New Orleans almost as soon as the floodwaters receded.
She had businesses that she had to get back online.
Ernest, with his congregation scattered by the storm, stayed behind in Texas, hoping to earn enough money to see the couple through the crisis.
So I think he stayed there for the job.
And when Ernest did return to New Orleans, he wasn't planning to be there long because a new opportunity promised to take the family and Ernest's career to the next level.
He was supposed to be moving to Atlanta to take over a 500-member church.
He was very excited about that new chapter in his life. Just excited about becoming pastor there.
So in April of 2006, prior to moving to Atlanta and taking charge of a much larger church than his old congregation, Ernest returned to New Orleans and the rented townhouse on the east side that served as Emma's temporary home.
New Orleans East was one of the areas to recover more slowly than others. There weren't a lot of people that lived there. It was a very, very desolate, very remote area.
And for Ernest, at least, it wasn't very safe either.
Within the week of him moving back to New Orleans, he was dead.
Coming up, the New Orleans police have no suspects.
Everybody loved Ernest. I didn't see him have any enemies.
But does that mean his death is a random robbery gone wrong?
It was almost the perfect place to commit a murder and get away with it.
At around midnight on April 12, 2006, 41-year-old Emma Smith called 911 and reported that her husband Ernest had just been shot, apparently right outside the couple's New Orleans home.
She said she heard what sounded like a popping sound. And she didn't think anything of it until she heard Mr. Ernest call and say, "Baby, I've been shot." And she said that's when she made her way downstairs to call 911.
When the New Orleans police arrived on the scene minutes later, they found the 38-year-old lying dead just inside his front door.
Ernest Smith is shot twice in the chest with a 9mm.
He fell inside of the apartment at the base of the stairs.
And based on where the investigators found 2 9mm shell casings, it appeared that his killer had been outside the house, waiting in ambush.
Those 2 shell casings are found outside, not far, but there's a sort of an alleyway that goes beside what appear to be apartments or like small townhouses all down a row.
But had someone specifically targeted the popular minister? Or was he merely another victim of the crime wave that surged through the city in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina? Emma said she had no idea. All she knew, according to what she told the police, was that Ernest had been out that night with his friend Ronald, attending bike night at a local bar.
Ernest Smith had just recently purchased a new motorcycle. He was learning how to ride a motorcycle. It was his first motorcycle.
And Ronald confirmed Emma's story when he arrived at the scene a few minutes later.
We received a phone call from Emma Smith stating that Mr. Ernest had been shot. And he made his way back to the scene.
Questioned by the police, Ronald said he dropped Ernest off at the apartment just minutes before the shooting.
Ronald tells us they come back to Ernest Smith's home, and they're outside sort of just having a conversation, talking about bike night and this, that, and the other. Eventually,
according to Ronald, Ernest had gotten out of the car and headed for his front door.
Ronald asked him, "So you sure you're gonna make it, inside?" And he was like, "Yeah, I'm safe, you can leave."
It wasn't an idle question, considering the city's semi-abandoned state in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina.
This particular portion of New Orleans East where they were living, it was a desolate, isolated area. The apartments were, for the most part, all vacant.
And despite his friend's assurances, Ronald said he'd even sat in his car and waited until Ernest reached his door.
He sees Ernest Smith go into his pocket, pull out his keys.
Then, according to Ronald, he drove away, apparently just moments before his friend was gunned down.
He said when he was on the interstate, after leaving Pastor Smith, he saw the police unit and he saw the EMS wagon. He didn't think anything of it.
The next thing that happens is he gets a phone call from Emma Raine saying that Ernest Smith has been shot. He says he's alarmed, he doesn't understand, he was just with him, there wasn't anybody out there.
But someone had been out there, and as a result, Ernest was dead.
I don't know if he was startled by the individual or if they called out his name or if they said anything to him, because he had to turn around to face them because the entry wound was to the chest.
But who had attacked the up-and-coming minister, and why? That was the puzzling part.
Everybody loved Ernest. I didn't see him have any enemies. Never heard of anybody saying that they disliked him.
Only one thing was certain. The flood-ravaged neighborhood offered few answers.
This was a totally dead area where canvassing the neighborhood would have produced nothing.
It was almost the perfect place to commit a murder and get away with it.
And still struggling in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, there was little the New Orleans police could do about it.
It was a time when the city was sort of just processing scenes. If there was a suspect, they would move forward, but if not, the case went cold and they would move on to the next one.
Which is precisely what happened in Ernest Smith's case.
They go out and they do an initial investigation, and then basically they come to a dead end. They have no more leads, they have no more clues, they have really no suspects.
With no witnesses, no evidence other than a pair of shell casings, and no immediate suspects, the case went cold and the police moved on.
Given what the police department was going through at the time, this goes by the wayside.
With her husband's murder still unsolved, Emma moved on too. Her kids were settled into new jobs and a new life in Texas, but she stayed in New Orleans, focused on her businesses. And in the aftermath of her husband's murder, she started spending more time with an old friend of Ernest's, an Army buddy named James Raine.
Him and James was in the same guard unit.
And in the wake of Ernest's murder, he was exactly what Emma needed to take her mind off the tragedy.
He was fun. He made people smile. He's very popular, and people just, it's like they flocked around him.
Emma and James started dating, and in 2008, they married and moved to Mississippi, building a house in James's hometown of Poplarville.
It was like 4,300 square foot, 4 or maybe 5 bedrooms upstairs, swimming pool.
For Mississippi, it was extravagant. It was a $400,000 home.
Emma had finally found the life she dreamed of as a child.
They had nice cars. They even had a boat, nice boat.
But after tragically losing 2 husbands, would her third attempt to make a life for herself finally last? Or would another tragedy bring Emma's world crashing down? It was March of 2013, 7 years after Ernest Smith's murder, when Detective Jacinda Chambers' phone rang.
It was a cold case, a homicide detective, and investigate cases after they were a year old.
The caller was Enoch Raine, the brother of James Raine. He'd recently seen the detective on television, interviewed on a true crime TV series that profiles cold cases.
James Raine's family in Mississippi reached out telling her specifically that they had information on a New Orleans homicide.
The homicide of Pastor Ernest Smith, to be exact.
Detective Chambers, as you would expect, follows up on the lead. She goes and sits down and meets with these individuals.
Although, as it turned out, Ernest's murder wasn't the only one the family wanted to talk about. Coming up, tragedy strikes Emma again.
James Raine had been murdered.
But is it a coincidence? Or will the cold case investigation uncover even more victims?
He would be number 4.
By March of 2013, it had been 7 years since the unsolved murder of Emma Raine's second husband, Ernest Smith. The 38-year-old minister had been gunned down outside the couple's New Orleans apartment during the chaotic aftermath of Hurricane Katrina.
As is the case with a lot of things that happened right after the storm, the case went cold, and eventually investigators just sort of put the case aside.
But one phone call had changed all that.
Detective Chambers gets a call from people who have some information about a homicide that took place in the city of New Orleans.
The caller was a man named Enoch Raine, the brother of Emma's third husband, James.
We put the ball rolling with contacting the Center Chambers, New Orleans Police Department.
However, the Ernest Smith case wasn't the only murder that Enoch was calling about.
They advised me that their brother James Raine had been murdered.
We want justice and to know what took place with James' murder.
James had been murdered in October of 2011 at the house in Poplarville while Emma was out of town visiting a client of her tax preparation business.
She had been trying to get in contact with him and she was unable to. So she called his mom and told his mom to go over to the house and check on him.
The mother goes there and is the one who ultimately finds him shot in the head in his bed.
Officially, the police in Mississippi had no leads, despite the fact that the couple's $500,000 home had been wired with security cameras.
The security system was down. It was unplugged, it was off.
And while Emma had been away when the murder occurred, the family was convinced that Emma had set the stage for James's killer before she left.
The last person to be seen on the surveillance cameras inside Emma and James's home is Emma Raine. And I believe it's the day before he is murdered, and she's seen in the image shutting the cameras off.
The security cameras weren't the only reason James's family suspected Emma either, because according to the family, it was no coincidence that Emma and James married just 2 years after the death of her second husband, Ernest Smith.
So her and James Raine had been in a physical relationship, certainly for some period of time before Ernest Smith is killed.
Could Emma and James's affair have led to Ernest's murder? According to the family, Ernest was aware of the relationship.
Family members of James Raine had heard him arguing on the phone with Ernest Smith, Ernest sort of telling him, look, stay away from my wife.
James's brother Enoch says he warned James to heed Ernest's words, that nothing but trouble could come from sleeping with another man's wife.
I told my brother, I said, do you know you flirting with death?
But it was Ernest who'd ended up dead. And within 2 years, James and Emma had gotten married, moved to Mississippi, and built a brand new house, a house that Ernest's death had essentially paid for.
They cashed in on the $800,000 insurance policy that she had taken out shortly before her husband's death.
Enoch said the family had been a little suspicious when the couple started throwing money around after Ernest's death.
I asked my brother, did he have anything to do with it?
James's answer had been no.
I said, you didn't have anything. And he told me again, no, I didn't. So I left it at that. We took him at his word because we're a family that's not wishy-washy. Say what you mean and mean what you say.
And according to Enoch, he now knew that James wasn't the one who'd killed Ernest. Enoch said that he'd learned the truth about Ernest's murder from a man named Terry Everett, who was practically a brother to James, too.
Him and James were very close. He was adopted by James' mother in his teenage years because his mother passed away.
When James died, Terry was living in Atlanta, but he had come home for the funeral. And after the service, Enoch and his uncle pulled Terry aside and told him what they suspected, that Emma was behind James's murder and that James and Emma may have killed Ernest, too.
They say that Terry begins to weep, hysterically weep. And they ask him, what's going on? Calm yourself down. What's going on?
That's when the bombshell was dropped on us. He tells us he killed Ernest.
Enoch and his uncle were stunned.
The vehicle goes silent for a little while. And my next question was, why? And he said, James and Emma got me to do it.
According to Enoch, Terry said he had been promised a share of the money from Ernest's life insurance, but it was an empty promise.
His deal was $10,000 and he never even got there.
He instead said that he got 2 clunker cars.
Emma and James had married and spent the life insurance proceeds themselves. And now, more than 5 years later, James was dead too. As the reality of Terry's confession sank in, Enoch told Terry that he had to go to the police.
We told him, when you're ready, we'll go with you. We'll do everything we can to help you, But even if it came down to having to pay for a lawyer, we'd help you, but you got to do the right thing.
Still, according to Enoch and his uncle William, Terry had agreed.
And I think he did make the admission out of guilt and also that he was missing James.
But for all his guilt, Terry had never followed through.
6 months came, nothing. A year came, nothing. 18 months came, nothing. And at this time, I'm at the point where, we letting the murderer walk the streets.
So in March of 2013, 7 years after Ernest's murder and almost 2 years after James had been killed, Enoch Raine and his uncle had contacted the New Orleans police.
These were decent, honest, hardworking people who simply wanted to convey something that had been sort of weighing on their mind for a time. They were having to give to the detective information about someone who was a family member. That's something that's very, very difficult.
They're snitching on their own family member, really. And to hear them talk about it, it really tore that family apart.
But was their story about Terry's confession true? According to Enoch, Terry had provided details.
We knew what type of gun We knew how many times he was shot, and that was something that was never revealed in this case.
And he'd also described just how the murder had gone down.
He says, I was waiting in my car. I watch him talk to another guy for a while. He says as soon as the guy leaves, he pulls off. He gets out of his car. He shoots him twice in the chest.
After the crime was committed, Terry drove away back to Mississippi. As he was crossing over the bridge over Lake Pontchartrain, he threw the murder weapon, the gun, into the lake.
It was consistent. Everything that they said that he confessed to was consistent.
Following up with members of Ernest's old congregation, the investigators also uncovered evidence that was consistent with the family's claim about Emma having an affair.
There were rumors from some of his members that she was no good, that she had boyfriends.
Emma's phone records, especially one call she made the night of Ernest's murder, just moments after talking to the police, provided additional evidence that pointed to the affair.
At that time, they don't know who she's calling. We later learned from her phone records, she's calling James Raine in Mississippi.
But some of the most damning evidence had to do with Ernest's $800,000 insurance policy. Half of that money should have gone to Ernest's daughter from his first marriage, but it had all gone to Emma.
She forged Mr. Smith's daughter name to the insurance documents, which allowed Miss Emma Raine to receive the $800,000 insurance policy.
Ernest's daughter had sued over the fraud and won.
She actually hired a lawyer, and they did a forensic guy come in with the handwriting and found out that wasn't her handwriting.
Was collecting almost $1 million worth of insurance Emma's motive for murdering Ernest? That's what the New Orleans investigator thought.
I got the certified documents from the fraud case, and I applied for an arrest warrant for first-degree murder and solicitation for first-degree murder.
The judge also issued an arrest warrant for Terry Everett, who was picked up first on July 13th of 2013.
They found him working on a pipeline in Texas, and they extradited him from Texas to New Orleans, Louisiana, where he was booked accordingly.
But would Terry, who'd already confessed to James's family, cooperate with the police?
I spoke with him, and he cried like a baby. I had never seen a man cry the way he cried.
But for all his tears, Terry never talked.
Terry Everett, once he was arrested, did not make any statements to Detective Chambers.
Not that he didn't want to say anything. It was like shock. I can't say nothing. I just can't believe that I took part in something that led me here today.
The authorities arrested Emma 2 weeks later on August 1st in Kansas City, where she was living with a new husband. The marriage had occurred in December of 2012, exactly 14 months after James's murder, nearly 7 years after Ernest's murder, and 18 years after the death of Emma's first husband.
And the first thing came to my mind was that, he would be number 4.
In fact, Emma had such a long trail of dead husbands behind her that she was confused when the police placed her under arrest.
She needed clarification as to why she was being arrested. I told her this was about her husband, and her words to me were, "What husband?"
Coming up, is the case against Emma a long shot?
There's no physical evidence tying Emma to the case.
Or will Terry finally come through?
He still has a chance to do the right thing.
On August 10, 2016, 11 years after Hurricane Katrina swept New Orleans, 52-year-old Emma Raine stood trial for the decade-old murder of her second husband, Ernest Smith.
This case had been a cold case for several years.
And according to the prosecutor's opening statement, Emma's motivation for killing her husband was just as cold.
The motive that Emma Raine had was the insurance proceeds that she was going to get as a result of this man's death. She was a very cold and calculating individual. She was ruthless.
There was one problem with the prosecution's case, though, one that the defense was quick to point out in its opening statement.
There's no physical evidence tying Emma to the case. There's no ballistics, there's no blood, there's absolutely nothing.
Of course, they did have someone who could tie Emma to the murder, the alleged triggerman, Terry Everett. But would he testify?
Terry Everett, once he was arrested in connection with this, at no time was ever willing to cooperate with the prosecution.
And since he had been unwilling to cooperate, the district attorney had decided to try Terry first in December of 2014.
We had to win the case against him in order to have a chance against Emma Raine. So it was the building block on which the Emma Raine prosecution was based.
Although even getting a guilty verdict against Terry had been no slam dunk.
There were no witnesses, there was no weapon, there's no DNA, there's no surveillance footage, there's no financial record showing a sudden large unexplained increase in Terry's bank account. There's none of those things that you would look for.
What they did have, though, was moving testimony from the brother of Emma Raine's third husband, James Raine. Enoch Raine claimed that Terry had confessed to killing Ernest as part of a plot that Emma and James had put together in order to collect the insurance money.
I sit there on the stand and had to repeat what he told me. I love him to death, but I still couldn't look at the fact that he was just as cowardly as my brother James and Emma.
It broke his heart to have to testify, and so the jury realized that he would never have done that had it not been the truth, because it was torture.
And that had been enough to seal Terry's fate.
He was found guilty of second-degree murder.
But would the life sentence he was facing be the leverage the prosecutors needed?
They offered us, if he would cooperate, to somehow work out a sentence for 40 years. Terry did not want to take that.
Still, despite his refusal to cooperate, the prosecutors called the convicted murderer as a witness during Emma's trial.
He still has a chance to do the right thing.
But would he take it?
It was a very dramatic moment. He was shackled, handcuffed on his wrists and ankles, and he refused to take the witness stand.
He sat with his attorneys, kept his head down. He didn't say anything.
Terry may not have willingly cooperated, but his silent show of defiance played right into the prosecution's hands.
We had to place on the record that he's refusing to answer in order for us to legally be allowed to impeach him with the statements that he had made to his family members.
Without Terry's refusal to testify on record, any testimony from the family about his confession would be hearsay. But since they'd given Terry the opportunity to testify and he'd refused, the prosecution was able to put members of the Raine family on the stand to recount the details of the murder plot that Terry had confessed to them.
She coerced and set this plan up and got him caught up, Terry caught up in it, and I feel for him.
And to explain Emma's motive for murdering her husband, the prosecution also presented a detailed analysis of how, prior to the murder, she had dramatically increased the amount of Ernest's life insurance.
She starts to increase the life insurance policies slowly, but in drastic amounts for Ernest Smith, up until the point where she's at $800,000.
The last bump came, I believe it was just 4 months before his death.
The prosecutor also explained that after the murder, Emma and her daughter, now in her 30s, had committed forgery to cheat Ernest's daughter out of her rightful share of the insurance money.
She has her daughter go in and forge the signature, signing over her half of the $800,000 to Emma Raine.
It wasn't speculation either. By the time Emma stood trial, her daughter had already pleaded guilty to fraud charges stemming from the forgery.
I imagine the only reason she did it was because of the pressure that her mama put up on her.
To elicit your child to sign or to forge a document that shed a different light on the investigation to show the means at which she would go through to get basically what she wanted.
And according to the prosecutors, there was only one thing that Emma wanted.
The money, the greed. This is what these crimes were about.
The fact that somebody could be so driven by money, I think, was really horrifying, that they would be willing to literally destroy the lives of people that they loved in exchange for money.
In fact, the prosecutors were convinced that Emma had destroyed more than one life.
It was not just about Ernest Smith. She had made her living killing husbands.
Not only had Emma's third husband, James Raine, been murdered too, there was also the tragic accident that had almost killed her first husband.
It was a mysterious sort of possibly hit and run. No one was really sure who was responsible. It rendered him a paraplegic.
Was the fact that he'd lived merely a glitch in Emma's plan? That's what her first husband's family suspected when a year later he choked to death on his feeding tube while lying in bed.
The mother and the deceased's brother tell us that the last person to be in the room with him was Emma Raine.
Her first husband's family also wondered whatever became of his life insurance.
They did not receive any money from his life insurance. They believed that there was a policy in place and that she likely collected. We just simply had tried to find documentation to support that, and we were not able to. We always kind of suspected that that was her first taste at how easy it might have been to receive financial gains at the death of her husband.
However, since they couldn't find any documentation, the judge didn't allow the prosecutors to present the evidence from her first husband's death to the jury.
There just simply wasn't enough evidence there to support that he had died at her hands.
However, the prosecutors were allowed to present evidence of the suspicious circumstances surrounding the death of James Raine.
The jury could consider this other evidence to determine whether or not this was consistent with her character, her motive, her interest, her intent.
And according to the prosecution, whether it was 2 murders or 3, the pattern was the same.
You don't get a lot of Black Widow cases. It's kind of fascinating.
Or was it possible that she was just a victim of circumstance and a series of tragic coincidences? According to the defense, the murders of Ernest Smith and James Raine did have something in common, that Emma wasn't involved in either of them.
Essentially, they say that there is no evidence that Emma Raine had anything to do with this.
For starters, they claim that there was nothing sinister about Emma increasing the amount of Ernest Smith's life insurance.
She claimed when he got a motorcycle that was the reason to increase his life insurance.
And Terry Everett's emotional confession to James Raine's family. According to the defense, it was possible Terry and James had conspired to kill Ernest without Emma.
In the defense's case, they portrayed James to be the evil one who planned all of this. They claimed that the insurance proceeds were supposed to go to James, who ultimately they say is the evil mastermind.
And since Emma didn't take the stand, when the case went to the jury on August 12th, the decision essentially came down to one thing: the credibility of a convicted murderer's confession to a bereaved family.
Unless the jury was able to believe the statement made by Everett, there would have been no foundation for the trial against Emma Raine.
Coming up, will Terry's secondhand confession be enough to convict Emma?
If not, this woman was going to destroy somebody else's family.
Or will the jury get hung up on hearsay?
Her defense attorney really felt like he had a good argument.
On August 12, 2016, the jury in Emma Raine's murder trial announced that it had reached a verdict. The 52-year-old was charged with orchestrating the murder of her second husband, Ernest Smith, and she was suspected in the deaths of her first and third husbands, too.
The Black Widow aspect was fascinating for both police, prosecutors, and the media.
People were very interested, just sort of horrified at the fact that this had happened so many times.
But would the jury believe Emma had killed one husband, much less all three?
I got the impression that she felt she was going to get off.
Her defense attorney really felt like he had a good argument that she wasn't involved and that it was an unfair prosecution.
After all, the entire case against Emma hinged on the confession that convicted triggerman Terry Everett had made to her third husband's family.
It's been a heartbreaking experience for them. They had to testify and tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury exactly what he had told them.
I know how we feel as a family. We want justice because if not, this woman was going to destroy somebody else's family.
But would the family get the justice they sought? It all came down to the jury's verdict.
Emma Raine was found guilty by a jury of second-degree murder.
She had no reaction really to the verdict.
But for the family of Emma's third husband, James Raine, the jury's decision came as a huge relief.
That guilty verdict, I'm talking about a weight lifted off. You can't bring people back, but knowing what I knew, that when they said guilty with her, it was lifted.
And she would be going away for a long time, too. On October 21st, the judge sentenced Emma to life without parole. And Emma only has herself to blame. According to the prosecutors, if she had stopped with Ernest's murder, Terry never would have confessed, and James's family wouldn't have gone to the police.
To find people who do the right thing just because it's the right thing to do is such a rare thing for us to find in this business.
If it had not been for that break, Emma Raine would still be out there.
Although in hindsight, James's brother wonders who made the bigger mistake, Emma for murdering James or James for marrying Emma.
What the hell was you thinking? You just done been a part of helping this woman murder her husband. What in the world you didn't think you was gonna be next?
The blood sample was never supposed to survive. For 40 years, it sat forgotten inside an evidence room in Indiana. A small piece of cloth, a few dark stains, a piece of evidence that investigators once believed might hold the answer. But decades passed. The case went cold. The detectives retired. The witnesses disappeared. The family of the victim learned to live with a question that had no answer. Who took Sarah Whitmore away on a freezing night in 1984? For years, the answer remained buried, until one decision changed everything. A decision to reopen a file everyone thought was already finished. A decision to test evidence that had been ignored for decades. And when the results came back, investigators discovered something that shocked everyone. The blood sample did not belong to the victim. It belonged to the person they had been searching for all along. The story began on a quiet winter evening in Indiana. January 17th, 1984. A night when the streets were covered in snow, and the small town of Fairview seemed frozen in time. Fairview was the kind of place where people knew each other, where neighbors waved from their driveways, where doors were often left unlocked, where a missing person case felt impossible, because nothing like that happened there. Not until Sarah Whitmore disappeared. Sarah was 29 years old, a high school history teacher, a daughter, a sister, a person remembered by everyone who knew her as someone who brought energy into every room. She was the teacher who stayed late to help struggling students, the person who organized community events, the person who always answered the phone when someone needed help. On the night she disappeared, Sarah had attended a school meeting. Nothing seemed unusual. Several teachers remembered speaking with her. They remembered her laughing. They remembered her talking about weekend plans. Nobody noticed fear. Nobody noticed danger. At 8:42 p.m., Sarah left the school parking lot. That was the last confirmed moment anyone saw her alive. Her car was found the next morning on a rural road outside town. The driver's door was slightly open. The headlights were still on. Snow covered the windshield. Inside the vehicle, investigators found her purse, her keys, her coat, everything except Sarah. At first, police believed she had walked away voluntarily. A misunderstanding, a personal issue, a situation that would resolve itself. But then they found something that changed the direction of the investigation. A small blood stain on the passenger seat. It was barely visible, almost missed. A detective at the scene noticed it while searching the vehicle. The sample was collected, photographed, logged into evidence. At the time, investigators believed it could become the key to finding the person responsible, but they had no idea how long they would have to wait. The first days of the investigation were intense. Police search fields, forests, abandoned buildings. Volunteers from the community joined the search. Hundreds of people walked through freezing temperatures calling Sarah's name. Her family stood in front of cameras asking for information. They believed someone knew something. They believed someone had seen something. And they were right. But nobody came forward. The investigation quickly focused on Sarah's personal life. Detectives interviewed friends, co-workers, neighbors, anyone who had spoken with her before she vanished. They searched for arguments, threats, anything that could explain why someone would want Sarah gone. But the deeper they looked, the more confusing the case became. Sarah had no known enemies, no history of conflict, no obvious reason someone would target her. The case became a mystery without a clear beginning, and without a clear suspect. Then came the first major breakthrough. A witness reported seeing a vehicle near Sarah's abandoned car, a dark-colored pickup truck parked on the side of the road. The witness remembered seeing a man standing nearby, but the description was vague. Tall, dark jacket, no clear face, no license plate, just another unanswered question. Investigators followed hundreds of leads. Most led nowhere. The pickup truck was never identified. The man was never found. And slowly, the urgency began to fade. Months passed, then years. The evidence remained stored away. The blood sample remained untouched. Technology changed. Police departments changed. The people who originally investigated the case grew older. Some retired. Some passed away. Sarah's disappearance became one of those cases people mentioned quietly. A tragedy from another time. A mystery that seemed impossible to solve. But Sarah's family never stopped believing. They kept photographs. They kept newspaper articles. They kept every piece of information connected to the investigation. They waited, because for them, the case was never cold. It was simply unfinished. Decades later, a new generation of detectives opened Sarah Whitmore's file. They were reviewing old unsolved cases across Indiana. Cases that had evidence collected before modern technology existed. Cases where science had changed faster than investigators could imagine. When they reached Sarah's file, one detail immediately caught their attention: the blood sample. Evidence collected in 1984, never fully analyzed, never compared using modern DNA techniques. A detective looked at the old report and asked a simple question: why was this never tested? The answer was complicated. In 1984, DNA technology was not advanced enough to identify a suspect from a sample like this. The evidence was collected, preserved, stored, waiting for the future. And now the future had arrived. The blood sample was removed from storage. The decades-old evidence was carefully transported to a forensic laboratory. Scientists examined the material. They prepared the sample. They extracted what remained. Everyone involved understood the odds were uncertain. 40 years could destroy evidence. Environmental damage could make testing impossible. There was no guarantee anything would be recovered. But then the results came back, and investigators realized they were looking at something nobody expected: a complete DNA profile, a genetic fingerprint, a piece of the past that had survived. The sample was entered into the system. The search began. For weeks, There was no answer. Then one morning, the phone rang. The message was short, but it changed everything. The DNA had produced a match. A name had appeared. A suspect connected to the case. A person who had never been considered before. A person who had lived for 40 years believing the secret was gone forever. The cold case was no longer frozen. The investigation had awakened, and the man whose blood had been found inside Sarah Whitmore's car was about to discover that time had finally caught up with him. Time had finally caught up with him. For 40 years, the person connected to Sarah Whitmore's disappearance had lived with the belief that the past was buried forever. The town had changed. The investigation had disappeared from the headlines. The evidence had been locked away, and the world had moved on. But the smallest piece of evidence had survived. A single blood sample. A trace left behind on a winter night in 1984. A silent witness waiting for someone to ask the right question. When investigators received the DNA match, they did not immediately announce it. They understood the weight of what they had discovered. A cold case reopened after 4 decades could not be rushed. Every detail had to be confirmed. Every connection had to be examined. Because the person identified by the DNA was not a stranger. He was someone who had been living quietly in Indiana for decades. Someone who had never been publicly connected to Sarah's disappearance. His name was Michael Turner. In 1984, Turner was 27 years old. He worked as a mechanic at a small repair shop outside Fairview. According to old records, he had no serious criminal history, no major arrests, no public accusations, no reason investigators would have looked at him during the original investigation. That was what made the discovery so shocking. For decades, detectives had followed dozens of possibilities. They had questioned people close to Sarah. They had investigated strangers. They had searched for a hidden enemy. But the person connected to the evidence had been invisible, living an ordinary life, watching the case fade away. When investigators began examining Turner's history, they found something unusual. He had been in Fairview on the night Sarah disappeared. That detail had never been investigated, not because it was hidden, but because nobody had thought to ask. Turner had worked late that evening. His employer confirmed he left the repair shop shortly after 8 p.m. Sarah disappeared at 8:42. The timeline suddenly became impossible to ignore. Investigators returned to the original case files. They looked at every witness statement, every report, every piece of evidence, and they discovered something buried in the paperwork, a note from an officer who responded to Sarah's vehicle. The officer had written that there was another set of tire marks near the abandoned car. At the time, investigators believed they belonged to a passing vehicle. The observation was never followed. Now, 40 years later, detectives looked at it differently. They searched for records of vehicles connected to Turner. They discovered he owned a dark-colored pickup truck in 1984. The same type of vehicle described by the witness. The same type of vehicle seen near Sarah's abandoned car. A forgotten detail suddenly became a major piece of evidence. The investigators knew they needed more. A DNA match could connect someone to a location, but they needed to understand what happened that night. They needed the story behind the evidence. They began rebuilding Sarah's final hours. They interviewed surviving witnesses. They reviewed old newspaper reports. They examined maps from 1984. Slowly, the timeline began taking shape. At 6:30 p.m., Sarah arrived at the school. At 8:42 p.m., she left. At approximately 9:15 p.m., a vehicle matching Turner's truck was seen on the road outside town. At 9:40 p.m., a nearby resident heard what sounded like an argument. At the time, nobody connected these events. 40 years later, investigators saw a pattern. The past had not changed. Only the ability to understand it had changed. The most emotional moment came when detectives met Sarah's family. They had waited decades for this moment. They had imagined answers. They had imagined justice. But nothing prepared them for hearing that the case might finally be solved. Sarah's younger brother, David, had spent most of his adult life keeping her memory alive. He had kept her photograph on his desk. He had attended every major update. He had answered every call from investigators. When detectives told him about the DNA match, He sat silently for several minutes. Then he asked one question. Is it really him? The investigators could not promise everything yet, but they knew one thing. The evidence had finally given Sarah voice. The investigation into Michael Turner moved forward carefully. Detectives began surveillance. They studied his daily routine. They looked for any evidence that could confirm the connection, because after 40 years, the suspect was no longer the same person. The young mechanic from 1984 was now an older man, a man with a family, a man who had built an entire life, a man who had carried a secret for decades. Investigators watched him from a distance. They saw him leave his home, visit local stores, spend time with grandchildren. To everyone around him, he appeared ordinary. That was the most disturbing part. The person connected to one of Indiana's most haunting mysteries had never looked like a suspect. He looked like everyone else. But evidence does not care about appearances. Evidence remembers. The detectives eventually approached Turner for an interview. They did not tell him everything. They wanted to see his reaction. At first, Turner seemed confused. He asked why investigators wanted to discuss a case from 40 years earlier. Then they mentioned Sarah Whitmore's name. The room changed. His expression shifted, only for a moment. But investigators noticed. They asked where he was on January 17, 1984. Turner answered quickly, almost too quickly. He said he could not remember. After 40 years, that was understandable. But then detectives asked about his truck, his old workplace, the road outside Fairview. And finally, they asked about the blood evidence. Turner stopped speaking. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then he asked one question. How did you find that? The investigators already knew. The evidence had found him. The interview ended. But the investigation had entered a new phase, because now detectives knew something more important than a DNA match. They knew Michael Turner was afraid. And fear often reveals what people spend decades trying to hide. Fear often reveals what people spend decades trying to hide. After the first interview with Michael Turner, investigators returned to the evidence room. They replayed every moment, every pause, every change in his voice, every second where his confidence disappeared. Because after 40 years, the case was no longer about finding a person connected to the evidence. It was about understanding why that evidence existed. The DNA had answered one question: who left the blood behind? But another question remained. What happened to Sarah Whitmore on that freezing night in 1984? The detectives knew the answer was hidden somewhere between the evidence and the silence that followed. They began examining Michael Turner's life in 1984 with a level of detail that the original investigation never had. Back then, investigators were overwhelmed. A missing teacher, a community demanding answers, hundreds of tips arriving every week. The case moved quickly. Too quickly. Small details disappeared beneath the pressure. But now, detectives had something the original investigators never had: time, and they used every moment of it. They pulled old employment records. They reviewed phone logs. They searched property documents. They examined forgotten interviews. Slowly, a different picture of Michael Turner began to appear. Not a criminal. Not a violent person. At least not publicly. But someone who had crossed paths with Sarah before. A detail buried inside an old interview suddenly became important. A teacher from Sarah's school had mentioned seeing Turner near the building several weeks before the disappearance. At the time, investigators dismissed it. Turner was a mechanic. His repair shop serviced vehicles from a school district. There was a reasonable explanation. But now detectives wondered, was it really just a coincidence? They searched further. They found service records showing that Turner had repaired Sarah's vehicle twice before she disappeared. The discovery changed the investigation. Because Michael Turner was not a stranger. He knew Sarah's car. He knew where she worked. He knew her routine. A connection that had been invisible for decades suddenly became impossible to ignore. Investigators returned to the witness who had seen the dark pickup truck near Sarah's abandoned vehicle. The witness was now elderly. His memory had faded, But when detectives showed him photographs of vehicles from 1984, he pointed to one, a dark pickup truck, similar to Turner's. He could not identify the driver. He could not provide a name. But he remembered one detail. The truck had a damaged rear light. Detectives checked old vehicle records. Michael Turner's truck had a repair history, a rear light replacement. January 1984, the same month Sarah disappeared. Another coincidence, another forgotten piece, another piece of a puzzle that had waited 40 years. The investigation team realized something disturbing. The original detectives had not failed because they ignored the case. They failed because the evidence had been ahead of the technology. The clues existed, but they could not connect them. Until now, the detectives prepared to search Turner's property. The warrant was based on the DNA evidence, the vehicle connection, and the reconstructed timeline. When officers arrived at his home, the neighborhood watched in confusion. Many residents knew Turner. He had lived there for decades. He was considered quiet, helpful, a familiar face. Nobody expected to see police outside his house. Nobody expected the reason. Inside the property, investigators searched every room, every storage area, every box. They were looking for anything connected to 1984, anything that could explain what happened. At first, they found nothing unusual. Old tools, family photographs, personal belongings, the kind of things found in any home. Then, in a locked cabinet in the garage, investigators discovered something unexpected, an old notebook. The pages were yellowed. The cover was damaged. Inside were handwritten notes from 1984. Most were ordinary. Work schedules, repair appointments, names of customers. But one page caught investigators' attention. A date, January 17th, 1984. And beneath it a short entry, only 4 words. She knows too much. The room became silent because those words changed the entire investigation. Detectives photographed the page, collected the notebook, and began analyzing every mark. Who was she? Why was the sentence written? Was it about Sarah or someone else? The discovery created more questions than answers, but it proved something important. Michael Turner had not forgotten that night. He had written about it. The investigators continued searching. Hidden behind a shelf, they found another item, a newspaper clipping. The headline was from 1984. Local teacher missing. Search continues. The article was folded carefully, preserved, kept for decades. The detectives looked at each other because this was not something someone accidentally kept. This was something someone chose to keep. The case had now moved beyond suspicion. The evidence was creating a story of a man who had spent 40 years living with reminders of what happened. The investigators contacted prosecutors. They began preparing for the possibility of an arrest. But before they could move forward, they needed one final piece. They needed to know where Sarah had been taken, because solving a disappearance requires more than identifying who was responsible. It requires finding the truth about the victim. The detectives returned to the old map of Fairview. They marked every location connected to the case. The school, the road, the abandoned vehicle, Turner's workplace. And then they noticed something, a location that appeared nowhere in the original investigation, a place connected to Michael Turner's past, an abandoned property outside town, a place he owned briefly in 1984, a place that had been sold only months after Sarah disappeared. Investigators stared at the map, because sometimes the most important clue is not the evidence you find. It is the place everyone forgot to look. And for 40 years, that place had been waiting. That place had been waiting. For 40 years, the abandoned property outside Fairview had remained almost invisible, a forgotten piece of land, a place nobody connected to one of Indiana's most haunting mysteries. The original investigators had searched roads, fields, buildings near the town center, but they never searched this location, because in 1984, nobody knew Michael Turner had any reason to be there. The property was not listed as his main address. It was not connected to his workplace. It was simply a piece of land he had purchased years earlier, a place where old equipment was stored, a place where he could disappear without anyone noticing. Now, with the DNA evidence and the recovered notebook, detectives looked at the property differently. They obtained permission to search. And when the first officers arrived, they immediately noticed something unusual. The land looked untouched, almost frozen in time. An old wooden structure stood at the edge of the property. The building was damaged by weather. The windows were broken. The roof was partially collapsed. But inside, investigators found signs that someone had been there recently, not living there. Searching, moving things, try to find something. The possibility changed the entire investigation because someone had returned to location after decades. Someone knew there was something hidden there. The detectives carefully searched every corner. They photographed everything. They collected samples. They examined the floorboards, the walls, the surrounding ground. Hours passed. Nothing. Then one investigator noticed something beneath a pile of old equipment, a metal container, covered in dirt, rust forming around the edges. Inside were items that immediately connected the property to Sarah Whitmore. A piece of fabric, a broken necklace, and a photograph taken before she disappeared. The investigators knew they had finally reached a place where the story changed forever. The evidence was no longer only about Michael Turner. It was about Sarah, the person whose life had been reduced to a case file for decades. The discovery was emotional even for experienced detectives, because every investigation has a moment when the victim becomes more than evidence, when investigators remember there was a real person behind the mystery. Sarah had a favorite classroom, favorite books, favorite students, a family waiting for answers. And now, after 40 years, the investigation was finally bringing those answers closer. The forensic team began processing the newly discovered evidence. The property became a major crime scene. The entire area was searched. Ground scans were conducted. Old structures were examined. And then came the discovery that changed the case again. Beneath the floor of the old building, investigators found disturbed soil, a section of ground that appeared different from the surrounding area. The location was carefully examined. The search continued through the night. And just before sunrise, investigators found something buried beneath the surface. A small personal item belonging to Sarah. A piece of jewelry her family had described years earlier. A piece that confirmed what everyone feared. Sarah had been there. The property was not just connected to the investigation. It was connected to her final moments. The discovery led to an immediate escalation. A warrant was prepared. Michael Turner was placed under constant surveillance. Investigators knew the arrest could happen at any moment, but they wanted one more conversation, one more opportunity to understand what happened. They brought Turner back for another interview. This time, the atmosphere was different. The confidence from the first meeting was gone. The detectives placed a recovered notebook on the table. They placed photographs from the property beside it. They placed the DNA results in front of him. For several minutes, Turner said nothing. Then he looked at the evidence and quietly asked, "How long have you known?" The detectives did not answer immediately. They wanted him to explain. Instead, Turner leaned back and stared at the table. 40 years of silence seemed to collapse in that moment. He finally admitted knowing Sarah. He admitted being near the school that night. He admitted driving toward the road where her vehicle was found. But he still denied causing her death. He claimed Sarah discovered something about him, something he could not allow others to know. The detectives listened carefully, because even in his confession, Turner was still trying to control the story. He wanted to explain, but he did not want to accept responsibility. He said Sarah confronted him. He said she threatened to expose him. He said everything happened suddenly, but investigators noticed something important. Every explanation he gave was designed to make himself appear like a victim of circumstances, a victim of fear, a victim of one terrible mistake. But the evidence told a different story. The blood, the hidden property, the notebook, the years of silence. All of it pointed toward one conclusion. This was not a random tragedy. This was a secret someone protected for decades. As the interview ended, investigators walked out knowing the case had reached its final stage. They had the evidence. They had the suspect. They had the timeline. All that remained was the moment everyone had waited 40 years to see, the arrest. But before that moment arrived, detectives received one final piece of information, a discovery from the original investigation files, a document nobody had noticed, a report written in 1984, a report that mentioned another person, another witness, someone who had seen Michael Turner that night, someone who had been silent for 4 decades. And when investigators found that witness, they realized the final secret of the Indiana 1984 cold case was still waiting to be revealed. The final secret of the Indiana 1984 cold case was still waiting to be revealed, because even after the DNA match, even after the hidden property, even after the evidence that connected Michael Turner to Sarah Whitmore's disappearance, there was still one unanswered question. Who else knew? Investigators returned to the original case file one more time. The file was old. The pages were worn. Some documents had faded. Some notes were barely readable. But buried among hundreds of reports was a single page that had been overlooked for decades. A short statement from a witness. A statement that had never been fully investigated. The witness was named Robert Hale. In 1984, Hale worked as a night security guard in a nearby industrial facility. His job required him to drive through the rural roads surrounding Fairview, the same roads where Sarah's vehicle was discovered, the same roads connected to Michael Turner's abandoned property. According to the report, Hale had contacted police 2 days after Sarah disappeared. He told investigators he saw something unusual that night. A truck parked near the old property, a dark pickup, the engine running, a man standing outside. At the time, police recorded the statement, but they never followed up. The witness description was considered too vague. The location seemed unrelated, and the investigation moved in another direction. 40 years later, everything changed. Detectives found Hale. He was living several hours away from Fairview, older now, retired. But when investigators showed him photographs of the evidence, he immediately remembered the night. He remembered the truck. He remembered the location. And he remembered one detail he had never forgotten. The driver was wearing a jacket with a company logo, a logo from the repair shop where Michael Turner worked. The detectives knew this could become the final confirmation. They asked Hale why he never came forward again. His answer revealed another painful part of the investigation. He said he had tried. After his first statement, he received a phone call. Someone told him to stop asking questions. Someone warned him that he did not know what he was getting involved in. Hale said he was afraid. He had a family, children, a normal life, so he stayed quiet. For 40 years, the investigators left the interview room, knowing they had discovered something bigger than a forgotten witness. They had discovered how the case remained unsolved. Fear. Silence. People choosing survival over confrontation. The truth had not disappeared. It had been pushed away. The prosecutors reviewed the new evidence. The DNA, the notebook, the property discoveries, the witness statement, the timeline. Everything connected. The arrest warrant was approved. The date was set. Michael Turner would finally face the consequences of what investigators believed happened in 1984. But before officers arrived at his home, detectives made one final visit. They went to Sarah Whitmore's family. They wanted them to hear the news directly, not from television, not from reporters, from the people who had spent years searching for answers. When David Whitmore opened the door and saw the detectives standing outside, he immediately understood. After 40 years, he had learned to recognize the look on an investigator's face. This time it was different. This time there was certainty. The detectives told him they were ready to make an arrest. David closed his eyes. For a moment, he looked like someone who had been carrying a heavy weight for decades. Then he whispered, "She finally has a voice." Those words stayed with everyone in the room, because that was exactly what the investigation had become. A search for Sarah's voice. A search through forgotten evidence, through damaged records, through years of silence. The morning of the arrest arrived quietly. There were no cameras waiting, no crowds, no warning. Just investigators approaching a house where Michael Turner had lived for decades. A place where neighbors believed they knew him. A place where nobody expected the past to return. When officers knocked on the door, Turner opened it. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then the investigators identified themselves. They told him why they were there. Turner looked down. Not surprised. Not angry. Almost tired. As if he had been waiting for this moment. The arrest happened without resistance. But as officers placed him in handcuffs, one detective noticed something. Turner looked back at the house. Not at his family. Not at the neighbors. At a small storage room near the garage. The place where investigators believed he had kept reminders of the past. The place where decades of silence had finally ended. The news spread quickly through Fairview. A case that had haunted the community for generations was finally moving toward justice. People gathered outside the courthouse. Some were shocked. Some were relieved. Some struggled to understand how someone could hide such a secret for so long. The headline appeared everywhere. Indiana 1984 cold case cracked. Decades-old blood sample identifies suspect. A case that began with a missing teacher. A case that survived 40 years. A case solved by evidence everyone thought was too old to matter. But the investigation was not finished, because now came the hardest part. The trial. The moment when the evidence would be examined. The moment when Sarah's family would finally hear the full story. And the moment when Michael Turner would have to answer one question he had avoided for 4 decades. What really happened on that cold Indiana night in 1984? What really happened on that cold Indiana night in 1984? That question became the center of everything. After 40 years of waiting, the courtroom became the place where every forgotten detail would finally be examined. The blood sample, the notebook, the hidden property, the witness who stayed silent, the evidence that had survived longer than anyone expected. For Sarah Whitmore's family, the trial was not about revenge. It was about truth. They had spent decades living with uncertainty, decades imagining possibilities, decades wondering if the person responsible was still somewhere nearby. Now, they finally had a chance to hear what happened. The courtroom was filled on the first day of proceedings. Reporters arrived from across Indiana. People who remembered the original disappearance watched closely. Many had followed the case since 1984. They remembered the search parties, the missing posters, the fear that spread through the community. And now, 40 years later, they were watching the final chapter unfold. The prosecution began by presenting the evidence that changed everything. The DNA. A single blood sample collected from Sarah's vehicle. A sample that had waited for science to catch up. The forensic expert explained how the testing worked, how the genetic profile was created, how it matched Michael Turner. The courtroom became silent as the result was displayed. A piece of evidence from the past connecting directly to present. The defense argued that the DNA alone did not prove what happened. They claimed the sample could have been left there during one of Turner's previous repairs on Sarah's vehicle. A possibility investigators had already considered, but the prosecution had more. They presented the timeline, the vehicle connection, the abandoned property, the notebook, the witness testimony. Piece by piece, they rebuilt the night Sarah disappeared. The jury listened as the story of January 17, 1984, returned, a night that had remained frozen for 40 years. The prosecution described how Sarah discovered information about Turner, information he believed could destroy his life. They explained that Sarah's investigation into suspicious activity led her closer to a secret she was never supposed to uncover. And when she confronted Turner, the situation turned deadly. The defense continued to challenge the evidence. They argued that time had damaged memories, that witnesses could be mistaken, that old evidence could be misunderstood. But the prosecution returned to one fact again and again. The evidence had survived. The blood did not forget. The notebook did not forget. The property did not forget. And neither did the people who continued searching. One of the most emotional moments came when Sarah's brother, David, took the stand. He was older now. His voice was quieter, but his memories were clear. He talked about his sister, not as a victim, as a person. He described her kindness, her humor, her dedication to her students. He told the jury about the years after she disappeared, the holidays, the unanswered questions, the moments when the family hoped the phone would ring. Then he looked toward Turner and said, "We never stopped looking for her." The courtroom remained silent because everyone understood this was not only a trial about a crime, it was about time, about a family that had waited 40 years for a moment of truth. The witness, Robert Hale, also testified. His testimony became one of the most important parts of the trial. He described the night he saw the truck near the abandoned property. He described the fear that kept him silent. He explained the warning call that made him believe he should stop talking. The defense questioned his memory. They questioned why he waited so long. But Hale answered simply, "Because I was scared." Those words changed the atmosphere in the courtroom, because suddenly the silence surrounding the case had an explanation. People were not silent because they did not care. They were silent because they were afraid. The prosecution then presented the notebook recovered from Turner's garage. The page dated January 17, 1984. The sentence written by hand. "She knows too much." The defense argued the phrase was meaningless. They claimed investigators were creating a story from unrelated details. But the prosecution asked the jury one question. If the words meant nothing, why did Michael Turner keep the notebook for 40 years? That question stayed in the courtroom, because sometimes the most powerful evidence is not what someone says. It is what they choose to keep. As the trial continued, more details emerged about Turner's behavior after Sarah disappeared. He moved. He changed jobs. He avoided discussions about the case. He never contacted investigators. He never joined the searches. He never publicly expressed concern. For 40 years, he lived with the knowledge that one day the evidence might return. And eventually it did. The closing arguments arrived weeks later. The prosecution described Sarah as someone whose voice had been taken away, but they told the jury that the evidence gave it back. The defense argued there were still unanswered questions. They asked the jury not to convict based on emotion. The jury listened. They reviewed the evidence. They considered every piece. Then they left the courtroom. For Sarah's family, the waiting continued, but this time it was different. For the first time in 40 years, they were waiting for justice, not answers, not clues, not another investigation. Justice. And after several hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom became completely silent. Everyone stood. The judge asked the jury for the verdict. The foreperson looked down at the paper, then looked up, and spoke the words that ended a 40-year mystery. Guilty. Sarah Whitmore's family closed their eyes. Some cried. Some held each other, because after 4 decades, the case was finally over. But the story of the Indiana 1984 cold case would continue, because it was never only about the person responsible. It was about the evidence that waited, the family that never gave up, and the truth that survived when everyone thought it was gone. The truth that survived when everyone thought it was gone. That was a legacy of the Indiana 1984 cold case. A case that began with confusion. A case that spent decades buried beneath unanswered questions. A case that returned because one forgotten piece of evidence refused to disappear. The verdict brought justice. But for the people who lived through the investigation, the meaning of the case went far beyond the courtroom. Because Sarah Whitmore was never just a headline. She was never just the subject of an old investigation. She was a person whose life mattered. A person whose story waited 40 years to be completed. After the trial ended, investigators returned the original evidence to storage. But this time, it was not placed away and forgotten. Every item was carefully preserved. The blood sample, the notebook, the photographs, the recovered belongings, the evidence that carried a story across generations. The detectives who worked on the case said the same thing repeatedly. The technology solved the case. But technology alone was not enough. The case was solved because someone cared enough to look again, because someone opened an old file, because someone asked why, because someone believed that an old mystery was still worth solving. That became the message shared with future investigators. Never assume a cold case is finished. Never assume the answer is gone. Never assume time has erased the truth, because sometimes time does the opposite. Sometimes time preserves what people tried to hide. The investigation also changed Sarah's family. For decades, they had carried uncertainty. They had lived between hope and acceptance. They never knew whether Sarah's story would have an ending. Now they had one. It was painful. It was not the ending they wanted, but it was the truth, and truth gave them something they had not had for 40 years. Peace. David Whitmore later visited Sarah's old classroom. The school had changed. The walls had been painted. The furniture was different. New generations of students walked through the hallways. But one thing remained, her memory. He stood near the doorway where Sarah had spent so many years helping others. And he said that was how he wanted people to remember her, not as a victim, as a teacher, as a sister, as someone who made a difference. The community of Fairview also changed after the case. People talked openly about the investigation. They discussed the mistakes, the missed opportunities, the importance of listening, because Sarah's disappearance had affected everyone. It had changed the way people viewed their own town, the place they once believed was impossible for something like this to happen. But years later, they understood something. Darkness does not always appear as something obvious. Sometimes it hides behind familiar faces. Sometimes it waits quietly in ordinary places. And sometimes the person holding the secret is someone nobody suspects. That was the hardest lesson of the case. The person responsible was not a stranger from outside the community. He was someone who had lived among them, someone who had watched the investigation, someone who knew the family was still waiting. The detectives involved in the case carried that reality with them, but they also carried something else, the knowledge that they had finally given Sarah her voice back. One investigator described the moment he first heard about the DNA match. He said the feeling was not excitement. It was disbelief, because after so many years of failure, the impossible had happened. The evidence they thought was lost had returned. The answer they thought they would never find had appeared. And that moment changed the way they looked at every unsolved case. A cold case is not an empty file. It is a story paused in time, waiting for someone to continue it. The Indiana 1984 investigation became a symbol across the country, a reminder of what modern forensic science could accomplish, but also a reminder of the human side of every investigation. Behind every sample, behind every photograph, behind every report, there is someone waiting, someone who deserves answers. Years after the verdict, a new detective reviewing the case asked an interesting question. What was the most important piece of evidence? Many expected the answer to be the DNA, the blood sample, the scientific breakthrough, but the detective answered differently. The most important piece of evidence was the fact that someone kept searching, because without that, the blood sample would have remained hidden. The notebook would have remained unread. The property would have remained forgotten. The truth would have stayed buried. The case was solved because evidence and determination finally met. Science provided the answer, but persistence found the evidence. And that was why Sarah Whitmore's story continued to be remembered, not because of the crime, not because of the suspect, but because, after 40 years of silence, someone finally listened. The winter night of 1984 had once represented a beginning, the beginning of a mystery, the beginning of decades of pain, the beginning of a search with no clear ending. But years later, that same story reached its conclusion. A blood sample, a forgotten file, a name revealed, a family finally hearing the words they waited a lifetime to hear. The case was solved. The mystery was over, but the lesson remained. Time does not erase the truth. It only waits for the moment when someone is ready to uncover it. It only waits for the moment when someone is ready to uncover it. That was the final message left behind by the Indiana 1984 cold case. Not a message written in a courtroom, Not a statement from investigators. Not a headline printed across newspapers. A message created by 40 years of waiting. Because the truth had never disappeared. It had simply been buried beneath time. The years after the trial brought a strange feeling to Fairview. For so long, the town had lived with a mystery. People had grown up hearing Sarah Whitmore's name. Parents told their children about the teacher who vanished. Older residents remembered the searches, the posters, the uncertainty. For decades, Sarah's disappearance had been a shadow over the community. But after the conviction, that shadow began to fade. Not because people forgot, because they finally understood. The unanswered question was gone. The waiting was over. The investigation had reached the place every cold case hopes to reach. The truth. The forensic laboratory that processed the old blood sample later preserved the testing records as an example of how modern science can transform forgotten evidence. The sample had been collected in an era when investigators could only document what they saw. They could not imagine what technology would become. They could not know that a tiny piece of evidence would one day identify the person responsible. But they preserved it anyway. That decision became the difference between an unsolved mystery and a solved case. The detectives often returned to that point. Evidence does not have an expiration date. Not when someone protects it. Not when someone believes it matters. The original investigators who worked Sarah's case in 1984 never saw the final answer. Some had retired years earlier. Some never knew how close they had come. But their work still mattered. Every photograph, every interview, every report, every piece of evidence collected during those first difficult days. All of it became part of the path that eventually led to the truth. The case was not solved by one person. It was solved by generations of investigators connected by the same goal, finding Sarah. The story also changed how Fairview looked at its own history. People began organizing events to remember victims of unsolved crimes. Families from other cases reached out. They shared stories. They shared frustrations. They shared hope. Because Sarah's case proved something powerful. A cold case can feel forgotten. But forgotten does not mean finished. There are families still waiting. There are questions still unanswered. Waiting. The detectives who solved the case later received many messages from people across the country. Some thanked them. Some shared their own unsolved cases. Some simply said Sarah's story gave them hope. Because if a blood sample hidden for 40 years could finally reveal the truth, then maybe other mysteries could be solved too. Maybe other families could finally receive answers. Maybe other voices could finally be heard. The old phrase cold case began to mean something different to many people. It no longer represented a dead end. It represented a challenge. A reminder that every unanswered question deserves another look. The final report on Sarah Whitmore's case contained thousands of pages, but investigators highlighted one small section, a timeline. A timeline showing every moment when someone refused to give up, the first officer who noticed a blood stain, the technician who preserved the sample, the detective who reopened the file, the scientist who recovered the DNA, the witness who finally spoke. Every person added one piece. Together, they rebuilt a story that time had tried to hide. The most emotional moment after the trial came when Sarah's family received the final evidence package. Inside were the personal belongings recovered during the investigation, things that had been missing for decades. Objects that once represented pain. Now they represented memory. Sarah's family placed them beside photographs from her life, a reminder that the woman behind the case was never forgotten. She was still the teacher who loved history, still the person who helped students, still the sister whose family missed her every day. The investigation had restored justice, but her family restored her identity. They refused to let Sarah become only a crime story. They wanted people to know who she was before the tragedy. And that became the most important part of the ending, because every mystery begins with a person, before the evidence, before the investigation, before the headlines. A person existed, a life existed, a story existed, and that story deserves to be remembered. The Indiana 1984 cold case cracked after decades of silence. A blood sample identified the suspect. But the real victory was something deeper. A family received answers. A community found closure. And a woman who had been waiting 40 years finally had her story told. The evidence spoke. The truth returned. And the voice that had been buried beneath decades of silence was finally heard. The voice that had been buried beneath decades of silence was finally heard. But even after justice was delivered, the story of Sarah Whitmore continued to echo, because some cases end with a verdict. Others continue because of the lessons they leave behind. The Indiana 1984 cold case became one of those stories. A story about patience. A story about persistence. A story about how the smallest piece of evidence can survive longer than anyone expects. Years after the trial, investigators still remember the first time they opened Sarah's old file. The faded photographs. The handwritten reports. The newspaper articles from another era. Everything looked like a mystery that belonged to the past. But they quickly learned something important. The past is never truly gone. It is waiting. Waiting inside forgotten evidence rooms. Waiting inside old records. Waiting inside memories people thought were no longer important. The blood sample was proof of that. For decades, it was simply a piece of evidence. A small item stored among thousands of others. Nobody knew it would become the key. Nobody knew science would eventually give it a voice. Nobody knew that one day, a laboratory would uncover a name hidden inside it. But that possibility existed because someone preserved it. Someone believed it mattered. That idea became the foundation of modern cold case investigations. Every piece of evidence tells a story. Sometimes that story is immediate. Sometimes it takes decades. But the story is still there. The detectives who worked Sarah's case often spoke about the emotional weight of reopening old investigations. They explained that every cold case carries unfinished emotions. Families who never received answers. Communities that never understood what happened. Victims whose stories were interrupted. Solving those cases means returning to moments where people were left behind. They stopped seeing old files as paperwork. They started seeing them as unfinished conversations. And Sarah's file was one of those conversations. A conversation that lasted 40 years. The final investigation also revealed something unexpected about the power of memory. Many people assumed the passing of time would destroy the truth. Instead, time created new opportunities. Technology improved. Old evidence became valuable again. People who were once afraid found the courage to speak. Memories that seemed uncertain became important pieces of a larger picture. That was what happened with Robert Hale. For decades, he carried the memory of the truck he saw that night. He carried the fear. He carried the regret. He often wondered if speaking louder in 1984 could have changed everything. But when he finally testified, investigators told him something that stayed with him. His information mattered, even after 40 years. Because truth does not become meaningless because it arrives late. The same was true for the evidence. The blood sample did not become less important because it waited. It became more powerful because it survived. The case also changed how people viewed Michael Turner. Before the arrest, many in Fairview described him as quiet, normal, unremarkable. After the truth was revealed, people struggled to understand how someone could hide such a secret for so long. That question remained one of the most disturbing parts of the case. How can someone live an ordinary life while carrying an extraordinary secret? Investigators said there was no simple answer. Some people hide behind routine. They build new lives. They convince themselves that the past cannot reach them. They believe time protects them. But time does not protect secrets. Time only delays their discovery. And eventually, evidence finds a way to speak. The old photographs from Sarah's case became some of the most powerful reminders of that truth. Pictures of a young woman who had no idea her life would become connected to one of Indiana's longest investigations. Pictures of someone who deserved more than a missing person file. She deserved to be remembered. That became the final purpose of the investigation. Not only to identify the person responsible, not only to close the case, but to return Sarah's story to her. The community eventually created a permanent memorial in her honor. The words written there were simple. They did not describe the crime. A teacher, a friend, a daughter, a life that mattered. People visited the memorial quietly. Some left flowers, some left notes, some simply stood there remembering. Because even decades later, Sarah's presence remained, not in the evidence, not in the courtroom, but in the people whose lives she touched. The detectives who solved the case understood that this was the true ending, not the arrest, not the conviction, not the headlines. The true ending was that Sarah Whitmore was no longer a question. She was a person again. Her name was no longer connected only to uncertainty. It was connected to memory, to justice, to the truth. And somewhere inside the evidence archive, the old blood sample remained, a small piece of history, a reminder of one of the most important lessons investigators had ever learned. No case is truly silent. No evidence is truly forgotten. And no truth stays buried forever. No truth stays buried forever. Those words became the final reflection shared by many investigators who worked on the Sarah Whitmore case. Because after everything was uncovered, one fact remained impossible to ignore. The truth had survived every attempt to hide it. It survived the passing of years. It survived changing technology. It survived forgotten records. It survived a belief that the case would never be solved. And in the end, it returned through the smallest piece of evidence, a blood sample, a single trace left behind on a winter night, a clue that waited patiently until someone finally understood its importance. The story of Sarah Whitmore became part of Indiana's history, not because of the tragedy alone, but because of the investigation that followed. The case showed the world that justice does not always arrive quickly. Sometimes it arrives slowly. Sometimes it takes decades. Sometimes it arrives after everyone involved believes they will never see the answer. But slow justice is still justice. For Sarah's family, the years after conviction were filled with complicated emotions. There was relief. There was sadness. There was anger for the time lost. But it was also gratitude. Gratitude that investigators never stopped looking. Gratitude that technology gave them another chance. Gratitude that Sarah's name was finally separated from the word missing. She was found. Her story was completed. The uncertainty that followed the family for 40 years finally ended. The investigators who worked the final stage of the case often describe a moment they close a file, not as a victory, not as a celebration, but as a quiet moment of respect. Because every solved case represents a life interrupted. Every piece of evidence represents a moment someone lost. Every photograph represents someone who once had a future. That understanding changed the way they approached their work. They knew behind every cold case was someone waiting, someone who deserved the truth. The Indiana 1984 investigation became a training example for future detectives. They studied the mistakes, the missed opportunities, the evidence that was overlooked. But they also studied the persistence, the determination, the refusal to accept that the case was impossible. Because the most important breakthrough did not happen in the laboratory. It happened when someone decided the file deserved another look. That decision reopened everything. It connected the past with the present. It gave science the opportunity to finish what earlier investigators had started. The blood sample became famous among forensic experts because it represented something bigger than DNA. It represented patience. A piece of evidence collected before anyone knew how valuable it would become. A reminder that investigators must preserve the truth even when they cannot immediately understand it, because tomorrow's technology may answer today's questions. The case also changed the way Fairview remembered January 17, 1984. For years, that date represented loss, fear, confusion. But after the investigation ended, people began remembering something else. They remembered Sarah's life. They remembered the teacher who inspired students, the woman who helped others, the person who brought kindness into ordinary moments. The community decided that the final chapter of Sarah's story should not belong to the person who harmed her. It should belong to Sarah. That was why her name remained important, because victims should never disappear behind the details of the crime. They should never become only evidence. They should never become only a headline. They are people. And people leave behind stories. The final documentary about the case ended with images of Indiana in winter, snow covering empty roads, the quiet streets of Fairview, the school where Sarah once worked. The place is connected to a mystery that lasted for decades. The narrator's final words carried the weight of the entire investigation. 40 years ago, a question was left unanswered. A pause. A family waited. Another pause. A community searched. And one small piece of evidence refused to disappear. The camera moved across the evidence archive, the old case file, the preserved photographs, the records that told the story. Then the final image appeared, a photograph of Sarah smiling, not as a victim, not as a mystery, as herself, because that was the final truth. The case was never only about finding who was responsible. It was about remembering who Sarah was. A person whose life mattered, a person whose story survived, a person whose voice was finally heard. The Indiana 1984 cold case cracked after decades of silence. A decades-old blood sample identified the suspect. But the real discovery was something far more powerful. The discovery that truth has patience, evidence has memory, and justice can wait. But it does not disappear. Not after 1 year, not after 10 years. Not after 40 years, because somewhere, hidden beneath the surface of every unsolved mystery, there may still be a clue waiting for science, waiting for courage, waiting for someone willing to look again. And when that moment comes, the truth speaks. The truth speaks. And when it does, it changes everything. For the people of Fairview, the story of Sarah Whitmore became a reminder that some mysteries are not solved by luck. They are solved by endurance, by people who continue searching when the world has moved on, by investigators who are willing to reopen old wounds, by families who refuse to let a name disappear into a forgotten file. The years after the case was solved brought a strange transformation. The places that once carried fear slowly became places of remembrance. The road where Sarah's vehicle was discovered no longer represented only tragedy. The old property where investigators found hidden evidence no longer represented only a secret. They became reminders that the truth had survived, that justice had finally arrived, and that no amount of time could completely erase what happened. The detectives who worked the final investigation often returned to one moment, not the arrest, not the trial, not the verdict, the moment when the laboratory confirmed the DNA match. Because that was the moment when an impossible case became possible again. A case that had spent decades trapped in the past suddenly had a future. The investigators remembered looking at the result on the screen. A name, a connection, a door opening after 40 years. They knew immediately that their work had only begun. A DNA match could start an investigation, but it could not tell the entire story. It could not explain the fear, the silence, the missing years, the unanswered questions. That required digging deeper. And the deeper they went, the more they discovered about the night Sarah disappeared. They discovered that the most important evidence was not always the most obvious. Sometimes it was hidden inside forgotten details. A witness statement that seemed too small to matter. A repair record that looked ordinary. A handwritten note with only a few words. A piece of evidence that waited for decades before revealing its meaning. The investigators described the case as a puzzle where the pieces were scattered across time. No single discovery solved everything. The solution came from connecting everything together. The blood sample, the timeline, the witness, the property, the notebook. Each piece alone raised questions. Together, they told a story that had been waiting since 1984. After conviction, some people asked whether the investigation should have happened sooner, whether more could have been done, whether Sarah could have received justice earlier. Those questions remained painful, but investigators also understood something important. The final breakthrough was not possible in 1984. The technology did not exist. The tools were not available. The science had not caught up, but the evidence had been preserved. And because it was preserved, the future had a chance to finish the work. That became one of the most important lessons from Sarah's case. Never underestimate old evidence. Never assume something has no value, because it does not provide an immediate answer. A clue can wait, a sample can wait, a file can wait, but the truth remains. Years later, new detectives studying the case often focused on one question. What would have happened if that blood sample had been destroyed? The answer was frightening. Sarah's case might remain unsolved forever. The suspect might have continued living without consequences. The family might have continued waiting. The community might have continued wondering. One decision made decades earlier changed everything. Someone preserved the evidence. Someone protected the possibility of justice. That was the invisible connection between the past and the future. The people who collected the evidence in 1984 never knew who would eventually use it. They never knew their work would matter 40 years later. But it did. Every report, every photograph, every collected sample. It all mattered. The final years of Sarah's case also brought unexpected closure to former investigators. Some of the original detectives who had worked the disappearance were able to see the conclusion before they passed away. For them, the resolution was emotional. They had carried the weight of an unsolved case for decades. They had remembered Sarah's photograph. They had remembered the searches. They had remembered the frustration of having no answers. Seeing the case solved gave them peace, because they realized something. They had not failed. They had simply been waiting for the future to provide the tools they needed. The story of Sarah Whitmore continued to be shared not as a story of failure, but as a story of persistence. A story about the importance of preserving evidence. A story about families who never stop hoping. A story about investigators who refuse to surrender. And a story about how one small blood sample changed everything. The world often believes that time hides the truth. But Sarah's case proved something different. Sometimes time protects the truth. Sometimes time allows evidence to survive. Sometimes time creates the distance needed to finally understand what happened. 40 years after Sarah disappeared, the question that haunted Indiana finally had an answer. The mystery was solved. The suspect was identified. The family received closure. But the message left behind was larger than one case. Because somewhere, right now, another forgotten file may be waiting. Another piece of evidence may still exist. Another family may still be hoping. And another truth may still be hidden. Waiting for someone to look again. Waiting for someone to look again. That was the message Sarah Whitmore's case left behind. Not a message written on paper. Not a message recorded in a statement. A message created by decades of patience. Because every cold case carries the same question. What if the answer is already there? What if the evidence was collected? What if the truth has been waiting all along? For Indiana investigators, Sarah's case became proof that those questions matter. The difference between an unsolved case and a solved case is sometimes not the discovery of new evidence. Sometimes it is simply seeing old evidence in a new way. The blood sample had always existed. The report had always existed. The witnesses had always existed. The truth was not created in 2024. It was uncovered. That realization changed the way detectives approached the future. They began reviewing other forgotten cases. Cases that had been sitting untouched. Cases where evidence was collected before modern forensic technology. Cases where families were still waiting. Because Sarah's story showed them something powerful. A case does not become less important because time passes. A victim does not become less deserving of justice because years go by. And a mystery does not become impossible simply because it lasts longer than anyone expected. The investigation into Sarah Whitmore's disappearance became a symbol of that belief. Across Indiana, law enforcement agencies began examining old evidence storage systems. They searched through forgotten boxes. They reviewed old reports. They looked at cases that once seemed impossible, not because they expected every mystery to be solved, but because they understood that every mystery deserved another chance. The forensic scientists who worked on Sarah's blood sample described the process as a conversation with history. The evidence came from another era, a time before modern databases, before advanced DNA analysis, before technology could reveal what was hidden inside a tiny sample. But science moved forward, and when science caught up, the evidence was ready. That was what made the discovery so remarkable. The answer had been there for decades, waiting. The final interviews with investigators revealed something else. The case changed them personally. Many detectives spend their careers solving crimes. Sarah's case was one of those, because it represented everything that makes cold cases difficult. The passage of time, the fading of memories, the loss of witnesses, the uncertainty. But it also represented everything that makes them worth pursuing. Hope, persistence, the possibility of justice. One investigator explained that when he first opened Sarah's file, he expected another unsolved mystery, a case with too many questions, too few answers. But what he found was different. He found a story that had never stopped moving. Every decade added something, a new technology, a new perspective, a new person willing to search. The case was not dead. It was waiting. The final evidence review before the archive was sealed revealed one last detail, a photograph from the original investigation. It showed the first officer standing beside Sarah's abandoned vehicle. At the time, they did not know what they were looking at. They did not know the importance of what they had found. They were simply trying to help. Decades later, investigators looked at that same photograph differently. They saw the beginning of the answer. They saw the first moment when the truth entered the investigation. That photograph became a reminder. Investigations are built from moments, small moments, a decision to collect evidence, a decision to preserve a sample, a decision to ask another question. Those moments can last longer than anyone expects. The community of Fairview continued remembering Sarah long after the trial ended. Each year, people gathered to honor her life. Not the crime, not the investigation. Her life. They remembered the teacher who inspired students, the friend who helped others, the woman who believed people deserved kindness, because that was the final goal of solving the case. Not simply identifying the person responsible, restoring Sarah's place in the world. For decades, her name was connected to uncertainty. Now it was connected to remembrance. The story of Sarah Whitmore became one of those rare cases where the ending was not only about what happened, it was about what was recovered. A name, a memory, a sense of peace. The Indiana 1984 cold case cracked because a decades-old blood sample finally revealed the person responsible. But the deeper truth was something else. The case was solved because nobody allowed Sarah to become forgotten. Her family remembered. Investigators remembered. The evidence remembered. And eventually, the world remembered too. The final words written in the investigation archive were simple. Justice delayed is still justice found. A sentence that represented 40 years of waiting, 40 years of searching, 40 years of believing that somewhere beneath the silence, the truth was still alive. And it was because the truth does not disappear. It waits until someone is ready to find it. Until someone is ready to find it. And when that moment arrives, even the oldest secrets can return. The story of Sarah Whitmore's disappearance had once seemed impossible to solve. A case trapped in another era. A mystery surrounded by unanswered questions. A file that many believed would remain closed forever. But the discovery of the decades-old blood sample changed everything. It proved that time does not always work against justice. Sometimes time preserves it. The final chapter of the Indiana 1984 cold case was not written with a dramatic confession. It was not written with a hidden message suddenly appearing. It was written through patience, through science, through the determination of people who refused to believe the past should remain unanswered. That became the most important lesson investigators carried forward. Every cold case represents someone's unfinished story. Every file represents a family that once waited for a phone call. Every piece of evidence represents a moment that cannot be repeated. And every victim deserves to have their story completed. Years after conviction, the evidence archive where Sarah's case was stored became a place of reflection for investigators. They walked through shelves filled with thousands of other cases, thousands of unanswered questions, thousands of stories waiting. Some had evidence. Some had witnesses. Some had only a name. But Sarah's case reminded them that impossible does not mean unsolvable. It only means the answer has not been found yet. The detectives who reviewed the investigation often talked about one specific moment. The moment they realized the old evidence was not just evidence. It was a message from the past. The blood sample was not simply a scientific discovery. It was a connection between two generations of investigators. The officers who collected it in 1984 and the scientists who analyzed it decades later. Two groups of people separated by time, connected by the same goal, finding the truth. That connection became the heart of the story. Because justice is rarely achieved by one person. It is built by many people doing small things correctly. A report written carefully. A sample preserved properly. A question asked again. A file open one more time. Those actions may seem ordinary, but sometimes ordinary actions create extraordinary results. The community of Fairview never forgot the long years before the case was solved. People remembered the uncertainty. They remembered wondering. They remembered the feeling that Sarah's story might never have an ending. That was why the conviction meant so much. It was not only a legal decision. It was the closing of a chapter that had remained open for generations. Parents who had searched for answers could finally rest. Friends who had remembered Sarah could finally speak about her without only remembering the tragedy. Students who never met her could learn about the person she was. The mystery became history, but the memory remained. And perhaps that was the most important outcome, because solving a case does not erase what happened. It does not bring back lost years. It does not remove the pain, but it gives people something they cannot live without forever: the truth. The final years of Michael Turner's life became a subject of public discussion. People wondered how he managed to live normally while carrying the weight of the past. Investigators never claimed to understand everything about his thoughts. But they understood one thing. Secrets create their own prison. For 40 years, the truth remained hidden, but the evidence was always there, waiting. Turner had believed the passage of time would protect him. Instead, time became the reason he was discovered. The same decades that allowed him to hide also allowed technology to advance. The same years that buried the investigation preserved the evidence. Time was not his protection. It was the thing that finally exposed him. That became the final irony of the case. The person who believed the past was gone was eventually defeated by the past returning. A single blood sample, a single match, a single moment when history caught up. The story of Sarah Whitmore continues to be shared because it represents something bigger than one crime. It represents the possibility of answers. It represents hope for families who are still waiting. It represents a belief that justice can survive even the longest silence. Somewhere, there are still cases sitting in forgotten rooms. Old evidence waiting. Old files waiting. Old mysteries waiting. And Sarah's story reminds investigators everywhere of one simple truth. Never stop looking, because the answer may already exist. It may be hidden inside something everyone has overlooked. It may be waiting inside a box that has not been opened in decades. It may be sitting quietly, waiting for the right person to ask the right question. The Indiana 1984 cold case cracked because someone finally asked that question. And when they did, 40 years of silence ended. 40 years of silence ended. But the impact of that moment reached far beyond one investigation. Because when the news spread that Sarah Whitmore's case had finally been solved, thousands of people across the country saw something they had not felt in years. Hope. Families connected to other cold cases began looking at their own forgotten files differently. They wondered if their answers were also hidden somewhere. Inside old evidence. Inside forgotten reports. Inside details that once seemed meaningless. Sarah's story became proof that a case is never truly finished while someone is still searching. The investigation had started with a disappearance, but it ended with a lesson about time, a lesson about evidence, a lesson about never giving up. The detectives who reopened the case knew they had inherited more than a file. They had inherited a responsibility to Sarah, a responsibility to her family, a responsibility to every person who had waited decades for answers. That responsibility pushed them through thousands of pages of documents, through old photographs, through interviews recorded on outdated equipment, through evidence boxes that had not been opened in years. They were not searching for a miracle. They were searching for the truth. And eventually, the truth revealed itself, not dramatically, but piece by piece. A blood sample, a forgotten witness, a hidden notebook, a location overlooked for decades. Each discovery moved the investigation closer. Each discovery proved that the past was still speaking. The final report on the case contained a sentence that investigators said represented everything they learned. Evidence does not become silent. People simply stop listening. Those words became connected to Sarah's story, because for 40 years, the evidence was there. The blood sample was there. The records were there. The memories were there. The truth had never vanished. It had only been waiting for someone willing to hear it. For Sarah's family, the years after the trial were not easy. Closure did not erase the pain. A conviction did not restore the lost time. There were still birthdays that passed without Sarah. Still holidays where someone was missing. Still moments when the family wished they could hear her voice again. But there was something different now. They no longer had to wonder. They no longer had to imagine endless possibilities. They knew, and sometimes knowing the truth is the first step toward healing. The family placed Sarah's photograph in a special place inside their home, not as a reminder of what happened, as a reminder of who she was. The teacher, the sister, the friend, the person whose life mattered before the investigation ever began. That was a final victory. Sarah was no longer defined by the mystery. She was remembered by the life she lived. The detectives involved in the case eventually moved on to other investigations, other files, other mysteries, but they carried Sarah's story with them, because some cases leave a mark, not because they're the most famous, not because they receive the most attention, but because they remind investigators why they chose this work: to find answers, to protect memories, to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. The Indiana 1984 cold case became one of those rare investigations where the ending was not just about catching a suspect. It was about restoring a story that had been interrupted, a story that had waited, a story that finally reached its conclusion. Years later, when reporters asked the lead investigator what he thought was the most surprising part of the case, his answer was simple: that the truth survived. Because that was the impossible part. The world changed. People changed. Technology changed. But the evidence remained. The truth survived every year that passed. Every false lead. Every unanswered question. Every moment when it seemed the case would never be solved. The blood sample survived. And because it survived, Sarah's voice survived too. The final image connected to the case was not the arrest, not the courtroom, not the evidence table. It was Sarah's photograph. A young woman smiling, a person with dreams, a person with a future, a person who deserved to be remembered. The investigation began with a question: where was Sarah Whitmore? 40 years later, another question answered it: who was responsible? And when that answer finally arrived, it changed everything. The case was solved. The mystery was closed, but the message remained. Cold cases are not empty stories. They are unfinished stories, waiting for someone to open the file, waiting for someone to examine the evidence, waiting for someone to believe that the truth is still there. Because sometimes the smallest clue can survive the longest silence. Sometimes the oldest evidence can reveal the newest answers. And sometimes, after decades of darkness, one forgotten piece of the past can finally bring justice into the light. One forgotten piece of the past can finally bring justice into the light. That was the final meaning behind the Indiana 1984 cold case. A story that began with fear. A story that carried pain for generations. A story that seemed destined to remain unfinished. Until one small piece of evidence changed everything. The blood sample was never just a sample. It was a bridge. A bridge between the night Sarah disappeared and the day the truth was finally revealed. Between the investigators who searched in 1984 and the investigators who continued the search decades later. Between a family's unanswered questions and the answers they had waited a lifetime to receive. The case became a reminder that justice does not always follow a straight path. Sometimes it disappears into darkness. Sometimes it takes years to find the road again. But the search itself matters, because every step forward keeps a story alive. After the case officially closed, the Indiana law enforcement community continued studying what happened, not the crime itself, the investigation, the choices, the decisions, the moments where a different action could have changed the timeline. They studied how evidence was handled, how information was recorded, how witness statements were preserved. Because every solved cold case teaches something, and Sarah's case taught more than most. It showed that old evidence can become new evidence. It showed that forgotten details can become important discoveries. It showed that the passage of time does not erase responsibility. One of the younger detectives who reviewed the case said that Sarah's story changed the way he looked at investigations. Before, he believed the most important moments happened during the first hours. The first search, the first interviews, the first collection of evidence. After reviewing Sarah's case, he understood something else. Some of the most important moments may happen years later, when someone opens a file, when someone notices a detail, when someone refuses to accept that there are no more answers. The future can solve the past. That became the phrase often connected to Sarah's investigation, because the detectives who solved the case were not undoing history. They were completing it. They were finishing work that had started before they were even involved. The original investigators collected the evidence. The future investigators understood it. Together, they solved the mystery. The story also changed how Sarah was remembered outside Indiana. People who had never heard her name before learned about her. They learned about her dedication as a teacher. They learned about the students who remember her kindness. They learned about the family who spent decades searching. The world saw more than a crime. It saw life. And that was exactly what Sarah's family wanted. They never wanted her to be remembered only because of how she died. They wanted people to remember how she lived. The final memorial ceremony, held years after the case ended, was simple. There were no dramatic speeches, no cameras, just people standing together, remembering. A former student placed flowers beside Sarah's photograph. Another left a handwritten note. It said, "Your story was never forgotten." Those words represented everything, because even when the case had no answers, Sarah was never forgotten. Her family remembered. Her friends remembered. The investigators remembered. And eventually, the evidence remembered too. The cold case that once represented uncertainty became a symbol of perseverance, a symbol that encouraged others to keep searching, a symbol that reminded investigators that every file matters, every victim matters, every unanswered question matters, because behind every case number is a human being, someone who had dreams, someone who had people who loved them, someone whose story deserves an ending. The Indiana 1984 cold case cracked because a decades-old blood sample identified a suspect. But the true story was larger than the science. It was about people. People who preserved evidence. People who searched. People who waited. People who believed. And people who finally discovered that the truth had been there all along. Hidden. Silent. Waiting. The final lesson of Sarah Whitmore's case was simple. Time can hide many things, but time cannot destroy the truth. Not when evidence survives. Not when memories remain. Not when someone is still willing to search. Because every cold case has a moment when the past reaches into the present, a moment when forgotten evidence speaks, a moment when a family finally hears the words they have waited decades to hear. We know what happened, and for Sarah Whitmore, that moment finally came. That moment finally came. And after 40 years of uncertainty, the story of Sarah Whitmore was no longer a mystery without an ending. It became a story of discovery, a story of resilience, a story of how one small piece of evidence could carry the weight of an entire lifetime. The final days of the investigation were quiet compared to the chaos that surrounded the case in 1984. There were no massive search parties, no endless news broadcasts, no desperate calls from a family waiting beside the phone. Instead, there was silence, the kind of silence that comes after a storm has passed. But inside that silence was something that had not existed for decades: understanding. Investigators finally knew the path Sarah's story had taken. Her family finally knew the truth. And the community finally knew that the question that haunted them for generations had been answered. The old headlines that once described Sarah as missing were replaced by a different message. A cold case solved. A mystery ended. Justice found. But behind those words was a much deeper story. A story about the people who continued searching when there was no guarantee they would ever find anything. The detectives who reviewed old documents late at night. The scientists who examined evidence collected before modern technology existed. The witnesses who carried memories for decades. The family members who refused to let Sarah become a forgotten name. All of them played a role. All of them kept the story alive. The investigation became an example of how justice is not limited by time. A crime may become old. A file may become dusty. A memory may become unclear. But the need for answers remains. That was why cold case investigations mattered. Because victims do not have a timeline. Families do not have an expiration date for their grief. And truth does not become less important simply because years pass. The final evidence review also revealed something emotional about Sarah herself. Before the disappearance, she had been planning changes in her life. New goals. New experiences. New opportunities. She had written notes about future plans, places she wanted to visit, things she wanted to learn, small details that showed she was not just a person in a case file. She was someone with dreams, someone with a future, someone whose story was interrupted. Those discoveries affected investigators deeply, because every case has a moment when the evidence becomes human, when numbers become names, when reports become memories, when a victim becomes someone you feel you know. That moment happened many times throughout Sarah's investigation, when they saw her photographs, when they read letters from her students, when they heard her family describe her laugh. The case was never only about what happened on one night in 1984. It was about everything that was lost afterward, the conversations that never happened, the moments that never came, the life that was never allowed to continue. That was why solving the case mattered. Not because it changed the past. Nothing could. But because it honored it. The detectives involved in the investigation often said they learned something unexpected. They learned that closure does not mean forgetting. Closure means finally understanding. It means no longer living with endless questions. No longer wondering if the truth will ever arrive. No longer fearing that the person responsible will never be found. For Sarah's family, that understanding became a gift, a painful gift, but a necessary one. They could finally stop searching. They could finally remember Sarah without always searching for answers. They could remember her life instead of only her disappearance. Years later, a young investigator reviewing the case asked an older detective why Sarah's investigation mattered so much. The older detective answered, because someone was waiting. Those simple words explained everything. Someone was waiting. A family was waiting. A community was waiting. And Sarah was waiting for her story to be told. The investigation proved that every case has someone waiting. Someone whose voice depends on others refusing to give up. That responsibility became the foundation of future cold case work. Detectives began looking differently at old evidence. They stopped asking, "Is this case too old?" They started asking, "What have we not discovered yet?" That change in thinking became one of Sarah's greatest legacies, because her story helped solve more than one mystery. It changed how people approached thousands of others. The final archive entry for Sarah's case was short. No dramatic language. No long explanation. Just a few words. Case solved. But behind those words were 40 years of searching. 40 years of patience. 40 years of hope. The Indiana 1984 cold case was finally closed, but the lesson it left behind remained open, because somewhere another forgotten file waits, another family hopes, another piece of evidence remains silent, waiting for someone to find it, waiting for someone to listen, waiting for the truth to speak again, waiting for the truth to speak again. That was how Sarah Whitmore's story ended, not with silence, not with an unanswered question, but with a reminder that even the quietest evidence can eventually change everything. The Indiana 1984 cold case became more than a solved investigation. It became a symbol of patience, a symbol of determination, a symbol of the belief that no victim should ever become forgotten. The years after conviction proved something investigators had always hoped was possible. A case can survive, a memory can survive, a truth can survive, even when decades pass, even when people move away, even when the world changes completely. The evidence can remain, waiting. The blood sample that identified Michael Turner was eventually placed back into secure storage, but investigators who saw it knew it was no longer just a piece of forensic material. It represented a promise that every piece of evidence deserves care, a promise that every victim deserves another chance at justice, and a promise that every family still waiting for answers should know one thing: someone is still looking. The story of Sarah Whitmore continued to influence new generations of investigators. Young detectives studying the case often focus on the same question: how did a mystery that lasted 40 years finally break open? The answer was not one discovery. It was a chain of decisions. A technician who preserved the sample, a detective who reopened the file, a scientist who examined old evidence, a witness who finally spoke, a family that never stopped remembering. Each person added one piece. Together, they created the moment when the truth returned. That was the power of cold case investigations. They were not only about finding criminals. They were about rebuilding stories. Stories that had been damaged by time. Stories where important details had been lost. Stories where victims deserved to be seen again. Sarah's case showed that justice is not always a race. Sometimes it is a journey. Sometimes the road takes years. Sometimes the answer arrives after everyone thought it was impossible. But every step matters. Every search matters. Every effort matters. Because one day, a single detail can change everything. The community of Fairview eventually moved forward. The fear that once surrounded Sarah's disappearance slowly became something else. Respect, reflection, remembering. People no longer gathered to discuss what they did not know. They gathered to remember what they finally learned. They remembered Sarah's kindness, her dedication, her impact, the lives she touched. The mystery had ended, but the person remained. And that was the most important part, because crimes create headlines, but people create memories. The final documentary about the case ended with a simple image: a quiet Indiana road covered in morning fog, the same kind of road where investigators once searched desperately for answers. The camera moved slowly. No dramatic music, no soaking headlines, only silence. Then Sarah's photograph appeared, a reminder that behind every investigation is a human being, a person who had dreams, a person who had loved ones, a person whose story mattered. The narrator's final words reflected everything the case had taught. 40 years ago, a question was left behind. 40 years later, the answer returned, not because time revealed the truth, but because someone refused to let time hide it. That became the lasting message of the Indiana 1984 cold case. The past is never truly silent. Evidence can wait. Memories can wait. Justice can wait. But they never disappear. Somewhere inside another old file, inside another forgotten evidence room, inside another unanswered mystery, the truth may already exist, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the right person, waiting for someone willing to look again. Because sometimes the smallest clue creates the biggest breakthrough. Sometimes a single piece of evidence can rewrite history. And sometimes, after decades of darkness, the truth finally finds its way home.